Dennis King is PEI's premier. Along with the provincial push he's referencing, the federal Conservatives have announced they're going to introduce motions to halt the hike to the price on carbon when the House of Commons returns next week. Let's get a preview of that debate with MPs joining us now from their ridings. Adam van Koeverden is the parliamentary secretary to the Environment Minister. Andrew Scheer is the Conservatives' House Leader. And Peter Julian is the NDP's House Leader. Hi to all of you. Thanks so much for making the time for the discussion tonight. Mr. Van Koeverden, I'll start with you. Premier King just made the case that 6 other premiers are making alongside him now, including one Liberal. And then there's an NDP premier in Manitoba who isn't ruling out explicitly asking your government for that hike on April 1st to be paused. Does that not warrant extremely serious consideration from your government?
Well, I'm glad that we're talking about the affordability crisis, and I'm also glad that Premier King referenced how he's lowering emissions in PEI, and I'd also add that he's lowering emissions in PEI with the federal government support, and up to 30% of those emissions reductions are attributable to our price on pollution. Now, we've introduced a price on pollution in provinces that don't have their own carbon backstop or cap and trade system as Quebec and British Columbia have. So it's actually up to Premier King in PEI whether or not there continues to be a price on pollution and a backstop program for islanders, because PEI could very easily have a cap and trade program or another emissions reduction strategy. But unfortunately, at this stage, a lot of provinces have decided to utilize the federal backstop program instead. And that's actually a good thing for people when they're looking at their checkbooks, because the rebate makes up for at least 80% of the families that are looking at that cost, because there is a cost associated with the carbon tax. But for 80% of families, they're getting more back through this rebate than they pay at the pumps.
If that is true, Mr. Van Koeverden, and I will note that the parliamentary budget officer says when taking into account all the extra indirect costs associated with the carbon tax, slightly more Canadians are actually worse off. If the point your government keeps making that 80% are better off is true, why are people approaching the premier at the gas station, asking him and pleading with your government to not further increase their cost of living?
Well, I think it's an easy scapegoat, to be honest. I think the carbon tax is an easy scapegoat for people, and that's been clearly documented by economists and journalists who are writing on this topic. And I've yet to hear from one economist in Canada that's saying that carbon pricing is having a material impact on the cost of groceries and the cost of living. So, I've actually printed off the reports from Trevor Tome and other economists from Alberta and brought them over to some of the critics on the Conservative side to say, look, bring me some literature indicating that carbon pricing is having a profound impact on grocery prices. And I've yet to receive any from Conservatives. And I've also yet to find any evidence that links grocery prices with carbon pricing. In fact, the number one driver of grocery prices in Canada is climate change itself. And if we don't fight climate change, then grocery prices will continue to go up.
So just really quickly, I just want to quantify that, because Premier King said that once the hike comes into place, alongside some of the other regulatory measures, it's about 30 cents extra to the cost of delivering the food to the island, which therefore gets borne by consumers who pay for it. Are you saying that that is not a lot of money for people?
Of course, every amount of money is important to look at. I'm not suggesting that 30 cents on the dollar, and I don't know where those numbers have come from. I listened to the interview with Premier King, and I'll note that Premier King didn't talk about the $880 rebate that all islanders will receive and starting on April 1st. So it's important to note that this is a rebate program. We keep calling it a carbon tax, but Supreme Courts across the country have designated this not as a tax because it's a rebate program and it's revenue neutral. This is actually a very, very conservative strategy. My neighbor in Wellington, Halton Hills, Michael Chong, has been advocating for a price on pollution and a revenue neutral carbon tax since as long as I've been following his political career. In 2021, the Conservatives ran their environmental platform in their election on pricing carbon. You'd have to go back to 2019 when my colleague Andrew Scheer was leader of the Conservatives to find an election platform that actually didn't include anything to lower emissions and fight climate change. But it seems like they've gone back to that strategy of ignoring climate change, not mentioning climate change, and pretending as though Canada doesn't have a role in fighting climate change and lowering our emissions. When in fact, our party and me personally feel that we have a strong role to play in lowering emissions and being an example to the rest of the world that you can build your economy and lower emissions at the same time.
Mr. Scheer, when I know your party has contended that this does make Canadians worse off, when the parliamentary budget officer did that analysis, he said that the majority of Canadians would be slightly worse off, but that primarily it would be felt by higher income Canadians, not lower and middle class Canadians. Is that not tenable to you, that to mitigate the large impacts of climate change, some Canadians will be worse off, but most of them, particularly low income ones, will not?
Well, first, I just want to address a few things from my colleague, the Liberal MP, who had two lies and a truth in his statement. He said that it was unfortunate that the carbon tax applies in so many provinces. That is true. That is unfortunate. The two things he said that weren't true, though, one is that emissions reductions can be attributable to the carbon tax. That's just not true. The government itself admits that they can't keep track of that. They don't even study that. And the second one is that, as you just pointed out, the majority of Canadians are worse off. And this is felt across many income levels. And what we do know is that coming April 1st, Justin Trudeau, during a cost of living crisis, while millions of Canadians are visiting the food bank for the first time, is going to raise the cost of everything. 23% hike coming in on April 1st. Conservatives are going to fight that. That's why we've announced that next week we're going to be using our time in Parliament to once again put pressure on Liberal and NDP MPs who might want to ignore what their Liberal and NDP bosses are telling them in Ottawa and listen to their constituents who are struggling under the high cost of literally everything these days.
And just to follow up with you, Mr. Scheer, I don't negate or take away from the struggles that people are facing. But to Mr. Van Koeverden's point, if you do look to any economist that has attempted to analyze the impact of the carbon tax on the price of food, they find it difficult to ascertain or to be able to conclusively say it is large or very tangible. The conclusion that Trevor Tombe out of the University of Calgary came to was essentially that it isn't very easy to measure and that it is not massive in scope in any way, that it's likely pretty negligible.
The carbon tax is becoming a greater and greater percentage of utility bills. It's raising the cost of home heating. It is raising the cost of food. And we know this because the parliamentary budget officer studied not just the direct impacts of the carbon tax, and that's what the Liberals have based their misinformation on. Their numbers are based on what you see on that line item, and that's what they've built their program around. But we all know that there are lots of other things that go up when the carbon tax goes up. When the farmer that grows the food has to pay a higher carbon tax, that increases prices. When the trucker that has to transport the food has to pay a higher carbon tax, those prices will go up as well. And when the retailer has to pay higher utility costs, all that cascades on to the cost. And even the Bank of Canada governor acknowledged that the carbon tax is a significant culprit in inflation. So we can link many, many things back to the carbon tax being a big part of the cost of living crisis. And a better question would be to Justin Trudeau, why is he so obsessed with ramming this through? You've got 9 out of 13 premiers who are fighting to at least pause the hike and cancel the increase. You've got 70% of Canadians unhappy with the carbon tax. The government itself acknowledges that they can't link any emissions reductions to the tax, and they haven't hit a single target they've set for themselves. So at this point in time, after 8 years of this failed approach, isn't it time to axe the tax and bring prices down?
I just want to quickly note before I move on to Mr. Julian that the testimony from the Bank of Canada's governor was that on an annual basis, the carbon price adds about 0.15 percentage points to inflation. Mr. Julian, both the Conservatives and the Liberals have accused your party of flip-flopping on whether or not you support the price on carbon. Do you support the hike to the carbon price, which will occur on April 1st? Is your party behind that?
Well, first off, we believe that we are in a climate crisis. We're not like the Conservatives, who are climate change deniers and who have offered absolutely not a single policy to combat the impacts of climate change that we're seeing right across the country. In British Columbia, a couple of years ago, we lost 600 people, including in my riding, because of the heat dome that is a direct result of climate change. But we also know there's an affordability crisis, and that's why the NDP put forward a motion just a few months ago that actually called to remove the GST off home heating. Now, the reality is, even what the Conservatives are proposing doesn't impact British Columbia and Quebec, as you said. Taking the GST off home heating impacts all Canadians in a positive way, helps to bridge that affordability crisis that we are seeing right now. And so the NDP put that forward. Liberals and Conservatives voted against. what Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are going to continue to be is the adults in the room, understanding there's an affordability crisis, understanding as well that there's a climate change crisis, and we have to take action that handles both. We also want to criticize both the Conservatives and the Liberals for their refusal to put in place a really effective retrofitting program for Canadians so that they can actually lower the cost of heating, for example. These are all things that consecutive Conservative and Liberal regimes have failed on.
In the absence, though, Mr. Julian, of support for the idea that you put forward around GST, my question was specifically whether or not your party is supportive of the fact that the price on carbon will increase April 1st, though 7 premiers are asking for it not to.
We believe for April 1st, we should be taking the GST off home heating. We believe that that would impact right across the country, including in British Columbia and Quebec. That is what we are pressing the government for. We're going to continue to push. In the absence of that, you're okay with the increase? We are going to continue to push to take the GST off home heating, to ensure that there's retrofitting available to all Canadians, and to ensure, because the oil and gas sector is reaping windfall profits right now, that those excess profits are actually put in a fund that allows Canadians to respond to the climate change crisis in a way that neither Liberal or Conservative governments have.
Okay, I'll just point out that didn't necessarily answer the question I asked about in the absence of what you want to happen happening. But I have 2 minutes left, and I want to get one point in from each of you right before we go. Mr. Van Koeverden, Mr. Scheer raised the point that you ascertained in your first answer that this specific policy will lower emissions by, it will be responsible for lowering emissions by 30%. The Auditor General in November said that this policy was one of 95% of the policies within the suite of climate change policies your government has that does not have an emissions reduction target associated with it. Where are you coming up with your math?
Directly from the Environment Commissioner in committee. He attributed a third of our emissions in Canada over the last 4 or 5 years to carbon pricing, and that's been demonstrated by Quebec and British Columbia, who have had carbon pricing programs in place a long time. But I wanted to talk about
so just sorry, that's the BC and Quebec program. That's not the federal government's backstop, is it? Because his report said that you did not have a target attached to it.
Our target has been clear. We want to lower our emissions by 35%, and we're on target to do that. And a third of the emission reductions that we've seen up to date are attributable to our carbon pricing program. And to back up how carbon pricing works so well, we've got provinces like Quebec and British Columbia who've been doing it for years, like over a decade in British Columbia, and we've seen emissions per capita drop precipitously in provinces that do. But I wanted to talk, because we're talking about an affordability crisis, about poverty reduction, because there's a lot of really good poverty reduction experts in Saskatchewan. And one, Peter Gilmer, is an advocate with the Anti-Poverty Ministry in Regina, and my colleague Andrew Scheer's home province and city, said that those on low incomes rely on the rebates to pay for essentials. And Alan Holman is one of those individuals in Saskatoon. He says, and I quote, "It gets plugged in with all the rest of my money for whatever's on my list, and I'm a little bit screwed if I don't get the rebate." So what Mr. Gilmer said was, for the vast majority of low-income people, whether they're on income security programs or earn low wages, they're actually better off in terms of the bottom line when receiving the rebate and paying the carbon tax. So once again, we see the Conservatives advocating only for the wealthiest Canadians. They don't care about carbon price, they don't care about climate change, and they do not care about Canada's poorest, most vulnerable people.
I promise you I wasn't joking about the fact that I only have 2 minutes left. So just a quick answer from Mr. Scheer and Mr. Julian. Mr. Scheer, your response to the fact that there are low-income Canadians who are worried about losing that rebate.
It's just totally false. You know, if the government tells you have to put $50 in a jar, if the government tells you have to put $50 in a jar, and at the end of the month you can pull $40 out of it, you're not better off. And again, what the Liberals have built their program around ignores all the cascading effect of the carbon tax on literally everything else you buy. And the Bank of Canada governor testified before committee that the carbon tax was responsible for about a third of the extra inflation that is plaguing Canadians. And one more time, the government's own documents, they tabled in the House, he said 0.6 out of the extra inflation, which is about 1.8 over target.
On an annualized
that
basis
works out to about a third. And what Mr. Van Koeverden doesn't want you to know is that his own government tabled documents in the House of Commons that said they have no ability to trace any reductions whatsoever to the carbon tax. That's their own words, and I can provide it with you. I'll provide it to you after the interview, Vassy, so that you have it, so that next time a Liberal comes on and says that it's responsible for reducing emissions, you know it's just bunk. It's been totally debunked by themselves.
Well, all I know is what I saw in the Auditor General's report, the Commissioner of Environment on November, which was that 95% of the plan did not have emissions reductions targets attached to it. But Mr. Van Koeverden's point is that he has testified otherwise since then. Mr. Julian, last word to you. Your message to 7 premiers who would like to see you and other politicians oppose the hike on April 1st, because it doesn't sound to me like you do.
That we are fighting the affordability crisis, and we are pushing the government to take the GST off home heating, which will help Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Peter Julian, Andrew Scheer, and Adam van Koeverden, thank you so much for making the time for the discussion tonight. I appreciate it.